Chapter 1 of The Adventures of Sammy Jay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel. The Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 1. Sammy Jay Makes a Fuss. Sammy Jay doesn't mind the cold of winter. Indeed, he rather likes it. Under his handsome coat of blue, trimmed with white, he wears a warm, silky suit of underwear, and he laughs at rough Brother North Wind and his cousin Jack Frost. But still he doesn't like the winter as well as he does the warmer seasons because he's a lazy fellow and doesn't like to work for a living any harder than he has to, and in the winter it isn't so easy to get something to eat. And there is another reason why Sammy Jay doesn't like the winter as well as the other seasons. What do you think it is? It isn't a nice reason at all. No, sir, it isn't a nice reason at all. It is because it isn't so easy to stir up trouble. Somehow Sammy Jay never seems really happy unless he is stirring up trouble for someone else. He just delights in tormenting other little people of the Green Meadows and the Green Forest. Dear, dear, it is a dreadful thing to say, but Sammy Jay is bold and bad. He steals. Yes, sir, Sammy Jay steals whenever he gets a chance. He had rather steal a breakfast any time than get it honestly. Now, people who steal usually are very sly. Sammy Jay is sly. Indeed, he is one of the slyest of all the little people who live in the Green Forest. Instead of spending his time honestly hunting for his meals, he spends most of it watching his neighbors to find out where they have their storehouses, so that he can help himself when their backs are turned. He slips through the Green Forest as still can be, hiding in the thick tree-tops and behind the trunks of big trees, and peering out with those sharp eyes of his at his neighbors. Whenever he is discovered, he always pretends to be very busy about his own business, and very much surprised to find anyone is near. It was in this way that he had discovered one of the storehouses of Chatterer the Red Squirrel. He didn't let Chatterer know that he had discovered it. Oh my, no! He didn't even go near it again for a long time. But he didn't forget it. Sammy Jay never forgets things of that kind, never. He thought of it often and often. When he did, he would say to himself, "Sometime when the snow is deep and Chatterer is fast asleep, when Mother Nature is unkind and things to eat are hard to find, I'll help myself and fly away to steal again some other day." The snow was deep now, and things to eat were hard to find, but Chatterer the Red Squirrel wasn't asleep. No, indeed. Chatterer seemed to like the cold weather, and was as frisky and spry as ever he is. And he never went very far away from that storehouse. Sammy Jay watched and watched, but never once did he get a chance to steal the sweet acorns that he had seen Chatterer store away in the fall. Said Sammy Jay to himself. "I must do something to get Chatterer away from his storehouse." For a long time Sammy Jay sat in the top of a tall, dark pine tree thinking and thinking. Then his sharp eyes twinkled with a look of great cunning, and he chuckled. It was a naughty chuckle. Away he flew to a very thick spruce tree some distance away in the Green Forest, but where Chatterer the Red Squirrel could hear him. There Sammy Jay began to make a great fuss. He screamed and screeched as only he can. Pretty soon, just as he expected, he saw Chatterer the Red Squirrel hurrying over to see what the fuss was all about. Sammy Jay slipped out of the other side of the spruce tree, and without a sound hurried over to Chatterer's storehouse. End of Chapter 1. Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Sammy Jay Gets Even with Peter Rabbit. "I'll get even with you, Peter Rabbit! I'll get even with you!" Sammy Jay fairly hopped up and down on the branch of the big pine, he was so angry. Peter just thrust his tongue into one cheek in the sauciest way, and then laughed at Sammy Jay. Of course it is true. as everyone in the Green Forest and on the Green Meadows knows, that Sammy Jay is a thief. But no one likes to be told that he is a thief, even if he is, Sammy Jay least of all. Like a great many other people who do wrong, Sammy Jay likes to pretend that he is a very fine gentleman, and he wants other people to think so too. So he takes great care of his handsome blue coat and struts around a great deal when he thinks other folks are looking at him. So Sammy Jay studied and studied how he could get even with Peter Rabbit. He called Peter Rabbit names whenever he saw him, but Peter didn't mind that in the least, for he could call names back again. Besides, names never hurt, and it is very foolish to call them. So Sammy Jay studied and studied how he could get even with Peter Rabbit in some other way. Then one day, as he sat in the big pine tree studying, Sammy heard a voice that gave him an idea. It was the voice of Redtail the Hawk, who, you know, is own cousin to Old Whitetail and to Roughleg. Now Sammy Jay can scream so exactly like Redtail the Hawk that you cannot tell their voices apart. When he heard that scream, Sammy Jay chuckled out loud. He had thought of a plan to get even with Peter Rabbit. Every day after that, Sammy Jay went peeking and prying through the Green Forest and around the edge of the Green Meadows without making a sound, just watching for Peter Rabbit. The snow was almost gone, and that is how it happened that Redtail had come back from the south where he had spent the winter. Sammy Jay felt quite sure that Peter didn't know that Redtail was back yet. He hoped he didn't, anyway. Early one morning Sammy Jay sat hidden on the edge of the Green Forest, watching the old briar patch where Peter Rabbit lives. He saw Peter come out of one of his private little paths and sit up very straight. For a long time Peter sat looking this way and looking that way over the Green Meadows. When he was sure that Reddy and Granny Fox were nowhere about, and that Roughleg was nowhere in sight, Peter kicked up his heels and scampered out onto the Green Meadows, away from the dear old briar patch, to see if there were any signs of spring. Sammy waited until Peter had reached the big hickory tree over by the Smiling Pool. Then very silently he flew over to the big hickory tree. Peter was so busy looking for Jerry Muskrat that he didn't see Sammy Jay at all. Suddenly, right over Peter's head, sounded a fierce, shrill scream. Peter knew that voice. At least, he thought he did. He didn't stop to look. He had learned long ago that it is best to run first and look afterward. So now he started for the dear old briar patch as fast as his long legs would take him, his heart in his mouth. Again that fierce scream sounded right over him. Peter ran faster than ever, and as he ran he dodged this way and dodged that way. Every second he expected to feel the sharp claws of Redtail the Hawk. My, such jumps as Peter did take! It seemed to him that he never would reach the dear old briar patch. But he did, and just as soon as he was safely inside, he turned around to see what had become of Redtail. And what do you think he saw? Why, only old Sammy Jay laughing fit to kill himself. "'Fraid cat! 'Fraid cat!" shouted Sammy Jay. Peter shook his fist. Then he grinned foolishly. "I guess you're even, Sammy Jay," he said. End of chapter 4. Of the Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Black Pussy Almost Catches a Good Breakfast. Black Pussy was out very early hunting for her breakfast. Not that she needed to hunt for her breakfast. Oh my, no! Black Pussy didn't need a single thing. Every morning Farmer Brown's boy filled a saucer with warm, fresh milk for her, and every day she had all the meat that was good for her, so there wasn't the least need in the world for her to go hunting. Black Pussy was just like all cats. Lying before the fire in Farmer Brown's house, blinking and purring contentedly, she seemed too good-natured and gentle to hurt anyone, and all Farmer Brown's family said that she was, and believed it. They knew nothing about the empty little nests in the joyful springtime, empty because Black Pussy had found them and emptied them, and broken the hearts of little father and mother birds. You see, Farmer Brown's folks really didn't know Black Pussy, but the little forest and meadow people did. They knew that Black Pussy was just like all cats, fierce and cruel down inside, and they hated Black Pussy, every one of them. They knew that down in her heart was the love of killing, just that same love of killing that is in the heart of Shadow the Weasel, and so they hated Black Pussy. If she had had to hunt for a living, they wouldn't have minded so much, but she didn't have to hunt for a living, and so they hated her. This particular morning Black Pussy had chosen to have a look along the old stone wall at the edge of the old orchard. Many times she had hunted Striped Chipmunk there. She didn't know enough about the ways of the little people of the Green Forest and the Green Meadows to know that this cold weather had sent Striped Chipmunk down into his snug bedroom underground for a long sleep. So she sneaked along from stone to stone, hoping that she would surprise him. She had gone half the length of the old wall without a sign of anything to catch, when she heard voices that put all thought of Striped Chipmunk out of her head. Crawling flat on her stomach to keep out of sight, she softly worked nearer and nearer, until, peeping from behind a big stone in the old wall, she could see Chatterer the Red Squirrel, Peter Rabbit, and Sammy Jay talking so busily and excited that they didn't seem to be paying attention to anything else. Sammy Jay was safe, because he was sitting in an old apple tree, but Chatterer was on the old wall, and Peter was on the ground. Which should she catch? Peter would make the biggest and best breakfast. But Black Pussy hadn't forgotten the terrible kick he had once given her when she had caught little Miss Fuzzytail up in the old pasture, and she had great respect for Peter's stout hind legs. She would be content to catch Chatterer this morning. She hated him anyway, for he had been very saucy to her many times. He would never make fun of her or call her names again. More slowly and carefully than ever, Black Pussy stole forward. Her eyes grew yellow with excitement and fierce and cruel. At last she reached a place where one good jump would land her on Chatterer. Carefully she drew her feet under her to make the jump. The end of her black tail twitched with eagerness. Just as she got ready to spring, there was a shrill scream from Sammy Jay. He had caught sight of the moving tip of that tail, and he knew what it meant. Black Pussy sprang, but she was just too late. Chatterer had dived headfirst down between the stones of the old wall at the sound of Sammy's scream, and Peter had dived headfirst into Johnny Chuck's house on the doorstep of which he happened to be sitting. Black Pussy looked up at Sammy Jay and snarled at him in a terrible rage. Sammy shrieked at her just as angrily. Then, when her head was turned for just an instant, he darted down and actually pulled a tuft of hair from her coat, and was safely out of the way before she could turn and spring. Then Black Pussy thrust a paw down between the stones where Chatterer had disappeared. She pulled it out again with a yowl of pain, for sharp little teeth had bitten into it. Slowly and sullenly Black Pussy turned and limped back towards Farmer Brown's house. She suddenly remembered that saucer of milk, and that was really all the breakfast she wanted. End of chapter 6. Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Chatterer Screws Up His Courage. Ever since Sammy Jay had dropped a hint about the plentiful supply of corn over at Farmer Brown's, and how easy it was to get all that one wanted, Chatterer had been trying to screw up his courage to go see for himself if Sammy had told the truth. Chatterer had spent most of his life in or close to the Green Forest. He had a very wholesome fear of Farmer Brown's boy and his dreadful gun, and he had always been content to keep away from Farmer Brown's dooryard. The truth is, he was afraid to go up there. You see, there were Black Pussy the cat, and Bowser the hound, and Farmer Brown's boy. Why, it was a terribly dangerous place. And yet Sammy Jay was up there every day, and didn't seem to be in the least afraid. He even scolded and said impudent things to Farmer Brown's boy. If Sammy dared go up there, why shouldn't he? He certainly was as brave as Sammy Jay. Right down in his heart Chatterer had always thought Sammy Jay very much of a coward.
Yet here was Sammy going up there and helping himself to corn just as if it belonged to him. Chatterer thought how hard he worked every day to fill that storehouse in the hollow fence rail, and how every minute of the time he had to watch out for Redtail the Hawk and Reddy Fox. It seemed as if he never, never could get enough corn to keep him all winter. And then it was a long way to go every day from the old orchard down to the cornfield. Chatterer sighed at the thought.
If Sammy Jay told me the truth, and it is so easy to get all the corn one wants over there at Farmer Brown's, it will be ever so much easier in bad weather, thought Chatterer. Anyway, it won't do any harm to have a look and see for myself how things are.
So Chatterer started running briskly along the old stone wall which led right up to Farmer Brown's yard. As he drew near, he would stop every few steps to make sure that the way was clear. At last he reached the very end of the wall, and hiding between two stones, he peeked out. Right across a wide road was Farmer Brown's house, and in the sun on the back doorstep sat Black Pussy dozing. Chatterer had to work hard to hold his tongue. The very sight of her made him so angry that he almost forgot that he didn't want to be seen. He just longed to tell her what he thought of her, but he kept still and set his sharp little eyes to discover where Farmer Brown kept his corn. He could see Bowser the Hound fast asleep in front of his own special little house. He could see the big barn and the hen house and the shed where the wagons were kept and the long wood shed.
"I wonder," said Chatterer to himself, "I wonder if that corn is kept in any of those places, and how Sammy Jay gets it if it is."
Just then Farmer Brown's boy came out of the barn. Chatterer dodged back at sight of him. He wanted to scold, just as he had wanted to scold at Black Pussy, but wisely he held his tongue. Farmer Brown's boy didn't even look towards him, but went straight over to a queer little building standing high on four legs, and with wide cracks between the boards of the walls, through which something yellow showed. Farmer Brown's boy went up several steps and opened a door. Chatterer gave a little gasp. There was the corn! More corn than he had ever seen in all his life! More corn than he had supposed the whole world held! Chatterer made up his mind right then and there that he was going to have some of that corn in spite of Black Pussy and Bowser the Hound and Farmer Brown's boy. The very sight of it screwed his courage up till he felt brave enough to dare anything. End of chapter 9. Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Reddy Fox Plays Spy. Reddy Fox didn't have to get up early to be hiding behind the fence back of Farmer Brown's corn crib, when jolly round red Mr. Sun chased the little stars from the sky. He didn't have to get up early, for the very good reason that he hadn't been to bed. You see, Reddy Fox does a great many things that he wouldn't like to have seen, and so he does them in the night when most of the other little people of the Green Meadows and the Green Forest are asleep. And so it happens that often he does not go to bed at all at night, but sleeps in the day when most honest people are abroad. He had been roaming about all this night, and now he had come to watch and see what was going on in Farmer Brown's corn crib, and whether or not Farmer Brown's boy had been setting a trap there for Sammy Jay, as Sammy was so sure he had. Just as the little stars disappeared and the first faint light from Mr. Sun began to chase away the black shadows, Reddy's sharp eyes saw something move over at the corner of the old stone wall at the edge of the old orchard. Then a little dark form scampered across the road, and there was the scratch of sharp little claws on the tree growing near the corn crib. Reddy grinned and watched the top of the tree. In a minute the same little form ran out along a limb that overhung the corn crib and nimbly jumped to the roof. It ran along one edge and suddenly disappeared. Reddy guessed right away that there was a hole there. He arose and stretched. "I thought as much," said Reddy to himself. "I thought as much." Then he lay down to watch again. After a while out popped the same lively little form. It was quite light now, light enough for Reddy to see the red coat of Chatterer the Red Squirrel. Chatterer's cheeks were stuffed so full of corn that his head looked twice as large as it really is.
He ran along the roof to where the tips of the limb of the tree brushed the roof, climbed into the tree, looked sharply to make sure that no one was about, particularly Black Pussy, and then ran down the tree and scurried across the road to the safety of the old stone wall. "Ha!" said Reddy Fox. "I thought so. Unless I am much, very, very much mistaken, Chatterer can tell Sammy Jay what caught him by the bill yesterday morning and frightened him nearly to death. I've wondered why he no longer came to that new storehouse of his that he worked so hard to fill down at the edge of the cornfield, and now I know. My, but Chatterer is getting fat. I think he will make me a very good breakfast. I do indeed." Reddy licked his lips, as if he could already taste fat Red Squirrel, and then slipped away in the other direction, for it was getting so light that he dared stay no longer so near Farmer Brown's house and Bowser the Hound. All the way to the Green Forest Reddy grinned, partly at the thought of the sharp trick he was sure Chatterer had played on Sammy Jay, and partly at the thought of the good breakfast he was sure he would have one of these fine mornings, for already he had thought of a plan to catch Chatterer. But first he would find Sammy Jay. He wanted to see how foolish Sammy would look when he found out that it wasn't a trap of Farmer Brown's boys at all that had frightened him so. End of chapter 14. Of The Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Sammy Jay spoils the plan of Reddy Fox. Reddy Fox found Sammy Jay in a bad temper. Sammy had missed his usual breakfast of corn stolen from Farmer Brown's corn crib, and it had made him cross. "Good morning," said Reddy in his politest manner, and no one can be more polite than Reddy Fox when he sets out to be. "Morning," mumbled Sammy Jay. "I found out something this morning which may interest you," said Reddy, taking no notice of Sammy's cross looks. "It won't," replied Sammy positively. "It won't. Nothing interests me." "Not even traps?" asked Reddy slyly. "What's that?" demanded Sammy, looking at Reddy sharply. "Oh, nothing much," replied Reddy, quite as if the matter didn't interest him especially. "Only I found something out this morning that I thought you might like to see if you wasn't such a coward." "Who says I'm a coward?" shrieked Sammy Jay, dancing about with anger. "I do," replied Reddy. "You don't dare go with me tomorrow morning and see what is going on at Farmer Brown's corn crib." "It isn't true!" Sammy shrieked. "I dare go wherever you dare go, Reddy Fox." "Then I dare you to meet me tomorrow morning at the edge of the Green Forest at sunup, and go with me to watch Farmer Brown's corn crib," Reddy replied. "I'll be there," snapped Sammy. "I'll have you to understand that you don't dare to do anything that I don't dare to do," snapped Sammy, though to tell the truth, he had felt his heart sink at the mere mention of Farmer Brown's corn crib. For you remember it was there that he had had a terrible fright only the morning before. "All right, see that you're on hand at sunup sharp," replied Reddy, and trotted away grinning, for he was smart enough to know that Sammy would risk a great deal rather than be called a coward, for no one likes to be called a coward. Early the next morning Reddy Fox and Sammy Jay met at the edge of the Green Forest. "Now," Reddy explained, "we will go over by the fence back of the corn crib. I will hide there, just where I hid yesterday morning, and you will hide in the evergreen tree close by. Watch the roof of the corn crib, and I think you will see something that may explain how you happened to be caught by the bill the other morning. But whatever you see, don't make a sound, not the least bit of a sound." Sammy promised, and they hurried over to their hiding places. Hardly had Sammy settled himself in the evergreen tree when he saw Chatterer jump to the roof of the corn crib from the limb of the tree which overhung it. Almost in a flash Chatterer had disappeared through a hole just under the edge of the roof. No sooner was he out of sight than Reddy Fox ran swiftly across to the old stone wall at the edge of the old orchard and hid behind it. Right away Sammy Jay guessed that Chatterer had had something to do with the terrible fright he had had at the corn crib when his bill was caught as he pecked at the corn between the cracks in the wall. "It wasn't a trap at all, but Chatterer," thought Sammy, and right away grew so angry that he could hardly sit still. But he wanted to see what Chatterer would do next, so he bit his tongue to keep it still. Pretty soon out came Chatterer with his cheeks stuffed full of corn. That was too much for Sammy Jay. He forgot all about his promise not to make a sound.
He darted out of his hiding place and flew at Chatterer in a terrible rage, screaming at the top of his voice and calling Chatterer every bad thing he could think of. Of course, Chatterer couldn't reply because his cheeks were so stuffed with corn, but he could run. Like a little red flash he was in that tree that overhung the corn crib and dodging around the trunk. Over behind the stone wall Reddy Fox snarled, for with such a noise he knew it wasn't safe to stay there any longer. End of chapter 15.
Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Chatterer and Sammy Jay quarrel. When people lose their tempers, oh, what a sorry sight! They call each other dreadful names and sometimes scratch and bite. The Merry Little Breezes ran and hid themselves away when Chatterer his temper lost, and so did Sammy Jay. It really was too dreadful. It quite spoiled the day for all the little people who were within sound of their voices. You see, when Sammy Jay discovered that it was Chatterer and not a trap set by Farmer Brown's boy that had given him such a fright at Farmer Brown's corn crib, right away Sammy's temper just boiled right over. Chatterer had his mouth so full of corn that he couldn't say a word, but he could run, and run he did, scampering across Farmer Brown's dooryard to the shelter of the old stone wall at the edge of the old orchard, with Sammy after him screaming, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" at the top of his lungs. "My gracious, what a racket!" exclaimed Farmer Brown's boy, as he opened the door. "That jay is making such a fuss that I should think there was a fox about." He put his milk pails down and stepped back into the house. In a minute he was out again, with his terrible gun in his hands. He went straight to the old stone wall where only a few minutes before Reddy Fox had been hiding, and it was well for Reddy that he had slipped away the minute Sammy Jay began to scream at Chatterer. Farmer Brown's boy looked disappointed when he saw no signs of Reddy. Then he went over to the little house of Bowser the Hound and unchained Bowser. Bowser wagged his tail and yelped with delight when he saw the gun, for he dearly loves to hunt. He ran ahead back to the old orchard, and almost at once his great deep voice told all within hearing that his wonderful nose had found the tracks of Reddy Fox. "I thought so," said Farmer Brown's boy. "I thought there had been a fox here." Then he sighed, for he would have liked nothing better than to go hunt for Reddy. But there were the empty milk pails, and Farmer Brown's boy is not the kind who ran away for pleasure when there's work to be done. Sammy Jay had flown away as soon as he saw Farmer Brown's boy and his terrible gun. Chatterer had hidden in the old stone wall, where he safely stored away the corn with which his cheeks had been stuffed. As soon as Farmer Brown's boy had gone to the barn to milk the cows, Sammy Jay slipped back to the old orchard to look for Chatterer, and his temper hadn't improved a bit. He soon saw Chatterer running along the old wall, and once more began to scream, "Thief! Thief!" And now that his mouth was empty, Chatterer could reply. And you know Chatterer has one of the worst tongues of all the little people of the Green Forest. "Thief yourself!" he screamed back. "Thief yourself! You stole my corn!" "It isn't your corn any more than it's mine," screamed Sammy. "I told you about it in the first place. Thief! Thief! Thief!" And from that they fell to calling each other worse things. The old orchard had never heard such a quarrel, never. It was dreadful. All day long they kept it up. Twice Farmer Brown's boy came down to see if the fox had come back, and scratched his head and wondered what all the fuss was about. At last Sammy Jay had a thought. "I'm going right over to the Green Forest to tell Shadow the Weasel where you're living," he cried suddenly. "When he finds you, you won't steal any more corn or be so greedy that you won't let other people have a share." End of chapter 16. Of the Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Chatterer Has to Keep His Promise. Chatterer wished now that he hadn't been quite so greedy. If he'd been content to let Sammy Jay get what corn he could from Farmer Brown's corn crib, instead of playing that sharp trick to frighten him away, Chatterer wouldn't have to make that promise to get the corn for Sammy and put it wherever Sammy wanted to put it. It wasn't much to do. Chatterer didn't really mind doing the thing himself. It was the thought that Sammy could make him do it. Now Chatterer has sharp wits, and Sammy Jay has sharp wits. Chatterer had always thought his the sharpest, and it hurt his pride to feel that Sammy had got the best of him. He thought and thought and thought and thought, trying to find some way to wriggle out of his promise, and just before he fell asleep an idea came to him. He would go over to the corn crib before Sammy Jay was awake, eat his fill, and then hide from Sammy. "Why didn't I think of that before?" he murmured sleepily, and smiled to think how, after all, his wits were sharper than those of Sammy Jay. The next morning, very early, Chatterer visited the corn crib, ate a hurried breakfast, and then hid in the old stone wall to watch for Sammy Jay. But Sammy didn't come at the time he used to visit the corn crib before Chatterer had given him that terrible scare. Chatterer waited and waited, but no Sammy Jay. Chatterer began to get impatient, but still he didn't dare leave his hiding place for fear that Sammy might come. At last Chatterer decided that Sammy had gone somewhere else that morning, so he came out of his hiding place and frisked along the stone wall at the edge of the old orchard. After a while he forgot all about Sammy Jay. Anyway, he was sure that Sammy wouldn't think of going to the corn crib so late in the morning, for it wouldn't be safe at all. Farmer Brown's boy would be almost sure to see him. So Chatterer forgot his troubles and frisked about and had a splendid time, all by himself. Right in the midst of it, Sammy Jay arrived in the old orchard. "Good morning, Chatterer," said he. "I fear I'm a little late for breakfast." "Breakfast!" sneered Chatterer. "Breakfast! Why, it's near dinner time. I had my breakfast hours ago." "I thought likely," replied Sammy, and there was a mischievous look in his sharp black eyes. "But I was rather tired this morning, and as long as I hadn't got to go way over to the corn crib myself, I thought I wouldn't hurry. I suppose you have plenty of corn ready for me here." "Corn ready for you? I should say not," snapped Chatterer. "You didn't say anything about getting corn for you this morning." "Didn't I? Well, I guess I must have forgotten to. Never mind, you can run over there and get some for me now," replied Sammy. "Go yourself," snapped Chatterer. "I think I'd rather not," replied Sammy. "Farmer Brown's boy is chopping wood right close to the corn crib, so I prefer to have you go." "I won't!" Chatterer fairly screamed and danced about in his rage. "I won't!" "Oh, all right," replied Sammy, yawning. "I saw Shadow the Weasel down in the Green Forest this morning, and he inquired for you. I think I'll go look him up again." Chatterer turned pale. He feared Shadow the Weasel more than anyone else under the sun. He would rather face Farmer Brown's boy. I'll go," he stammered weakly. There was no way out of it. He just had to keep his promise. End of chapter 18. (22) of the Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Chatterer has a dreadful day. Chatterer was feeling quite like himself, his saucy, impudent self, as he peeped out of his doorway at daylight. He felt that he had got the best of Sammy Jay the day before. To be sure, he had had to get corn for Sammy, but he did not have to go to Farmer Brown's corn crib for it, and he knew that it was the fun of seeing him take that risk that Sammy wanted more than he did the corn. He felt that he had been smarter than Sammy, and the feeling made him quite like his old self. "Chickaroo and chickaree, who is there as smart as me? Chickaroo and chickaree, sharper wits you'll never see." Now that was boasting, and boasting is one of the most foolish habits in the world. But Chatterer always was a boaster, and probably always will be. So he whisked in and out of the old stone wall and said this over and over while he waited for Sammy Jay to appear. He had not gone over to Farmer Brown's corn crib this morning for his breakfast, because he felt sure that Sammy would come and send him for corn, and he knew that he would have to go. But he meant to go down to his own storehouse in the hollow rail on the edge of the cornfield, and he could eat his fill there. So he scampered about and wished that Sammy would hurry up, for he was hungry. At last Sammy came, and, just as Chatterer expected, he demanded the corn that Chatterer had promised to get for him whenever he should ask for it. Right away Chatterer started for the cornfield, running along the fences. He always did like to run along fences, and though it was a long way down there, he didn't mind, for it was a sharp, cold morning, and the run made him feel fine. As he ran, he kept chuckling to himself to think how smart he had been to think of that storehouse and a way to keep his promise to Sammy Jay without running any risk to himself. He was whisking along the fence on the edge of the cornfield, and had almost reached the hollow rail where he stored the corn. He stopped to sit up on a fence post and boast once more. "Chickaroo and chickaree, who is there as smart—" He didn't finish. Instead, his tongue seemed to stick to the roof of his mouth, and his little black eyes looked as if they would pop out of his head. Sitting on a post close to the hollow rail was a straight black form watching him with cruel, hungry-looking eyes. It was Roughleg the Hawk! Chatterer gave a little gasp of fright. He whirled around and started back along the fence as fast as he could make his legs go. Instantly Roughleg spread his great wings and sailed after him. Chatterer hadn't gone the length of 2 rails before Roughleg was over him. With his great, cruel claws spread wide, he suddenly swooped down. Chatterer dodged to the underside of the rail just in time, the very nick of time. Roughleg screamed with disappointment, and that scream had such a fierce sound that Chatterer shivered all over. How he ever got back to the Old Orchard he hardly knew himself. Ever so many times he just managed to dodge those great claws. But he did get there at last, out of breath and tired and frightened. There sat Sammy Jay waiting for his corn. He pretended to be very angry because Chatterer had none, and threatened to go straight to the Green Forest and tell Shadow the Weasel where Chatterer was living. There was nothing for Chatterer to do but to go over to the corn crib as soon as he had rested a little. "It's been a dreadful day, a perfectly dreadful day," said Chatterer to himself, as he curled up in bed for the night. I wonder how old Roughleg happened to be sitting on that fence post this morning." But Sammy Jay didn't wonder. He knew. End of chapter 22. The Adventures of Sammy Jay by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Chatterer hits on a plan at last. Each time that Chatterer thought himself smarter than Sammy Jay, he found that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was, and this always made him feel mortified. He just couldn't admit, even to himself, that Sammy was the smartest, and yet here he was every day, bringing corn for Sammy from Farmer Brown's corn crib whenever Sammy told him to, and running the risk of being seen by Farmer Brown's boy, all because he hadn't been able to think of some way to outwit Sammy. Once more, after he had had such a narrow escape from old Roughleg the Hawk, he had tried going down to his storehouse at the edge of the cornfield, but he had found Roughleg on watch and had turned back. From the way Sammy Jay had grinned when he saw Chatterer coming back, Chatterer had made up his mind that Sammy knew something about how old Roughleg happened to have found out about that storehouse and so been on the watch. Now all this time Sammy Jay was having a great deal of fun out of Chatterer's trouble. Each time that Chatterer thought of a plan to outwit Sammy, he would find that Sammy had already thought of it, and a way to make the plan quite useless. You see, Sammy used to spend a great deal of his time when he was alone in the Green Forest, pretending that he was in the same fix as Chatterer and then trying to think of some way out of it. So it was that Chatterer never could think of a plan that Sammy hadn't already thought of. And yet there was a way to cheat Sammy out of his fun, though not out of his corn, and it really was the fun of seeing Chatterer so worried that Sammy cared most about. Sammy had thought of it almost at once, and it seemed to him that Chatterer was very, very stupid not to think of it too. "He will think of it some day, and I don't see any way to upset such a simple plan," said Sammy to himself, and then fell to studying some new way to torment Chatterer. And at last Chatterer did think of it. It was such a simple plan. Probably that was why he hadn't thought of it before. All he had to do was to go over to Farmer Brown's corn crib at break of day, before anyone in Farmer Brown's house was awake, just as he'd been doing, only make 2 or 3 trips and store a lot of corn in a safe hiding place in the old stone wall. Then, when Sammy Jay demanded corn, he could get it without trouble or danger. He tried it, and it worked splendidly. Sammy Jay got his corn, but he didn't get any fun, and he cared more for fun of seeing Chatterer in trouble than he did for the corn. So, after 2 or 3 mornings, Sammy didn't come up to the Old Orchard, and Chatterer chuckled as he stored up the corn, not in one place, but in several places. Now, while Sammy Jay seemed to have grown tired of corn, he was doing a lot of thinking. He had no idea of leaving Chatterer alone. He had just got to think of some way of upsetting Chatterer's simple plan. It was Reddy Fox who finally gave him the idea. He saw Reddy trotting down the Lone Little Path through the Green Forest, and right away the idea came to him. He would tell Reddy where Chatterer was storing the corn in the old stone wall, and Reddy would hide close by. Of course, I don't want Reddy Fox to catch Chatterer, but I can prevent that by warning him just in time. But he will be so frightened that he won't dare to go to that place for corn again in a hurry, and so we'll have to go to the corn crib for it, thought Sammy, and hurried to tell Reddy Fox about the place halfway along the old stone wall where Chatterer had hidden his corn. End of chapter 23.